Everyone knows Bruno Mars, the performer, the gold suits, the falsetto, the sold-out stadiums. Fewer people know the kid who was already working 2 shows a night before he'd lost his first tooth, or the young man who slept in a busted-up bird sanctuary because there was nowhere else to go, or the version of him who spent the better part of 2 years watching his own name get dragged through a rumor he never asked for. This is the story of how Bruno Mars got from a stage in Waikiki to the middle of a viral gambling scandal, and how, on a stage in Las Vegas in the spring of 2026, he finally said something about himself. Bruno Mars was born Peter Gene Hernandez on October 8, 1985, in Honolulu, Hawaii, the fourth of 6 children in a family where nobody was allowed to sit quietly in the corner. His father, Pete Hernandez, was a Latin percussionist for Brooklyn who went by Dr. Doo-Wop. His mother, Bernadette, was a Filipinous singer and hula dancer. They'd met performing in the same show, and by the time their son was old enough to stand up straight, they'd folded him into it. At 2 years old, he got the nickname Bruno from his father because, as the family told it for years, he looked like the barrel-chested wrestler Bruno Sammartino. By 4, he was performing 5 nights a week with the family band, the Love Notes, at venues like the Sheraton Waikiki. An uncle who worked as an Elvis impersonator started teaching him Presley's stage moves, and it stuck immediately. He was doing the hip shakes, the sneer, the whole act, small enough that adults found it almost eerie. The local press picked up on it fast. In 1990, at 5 years old, he was written up in the Hawaii tabloid midweek as Little Elvis, and that same year he performed in the halftime show of the Aloha Bowl in front of a packed stadium. A year later, he appeared on the Arsenio Hall show. In 1992, he landed a small role in the film Honeymoon in Vegas, credited as Bruno Hernandez, playing, of course, a miniature Elvis impersonator. By the time most kids his age were learning long division, he had already logged an enormous number of live performances, working 2 shows a night through most of grade school, singing doo-wop staples and old Frankie Lima numbers to rooms full of tourists. It gave him something most performers spend years trying to fake: total comfort under lights. Decades later, rehearsing for the Super Bowl halftime show, he described the whole process as feeling less like pressure and more like recess. That's not bravado. That's just what happens when you've been doing the same basic job since before you could read. The family act didn't survive Bruno's adolescence. His parents divorced when he was 12, and the Love Notes dissolved along with the marriage. The steady income disappeared almost overnight, and the Hernandez household went through a genuinely hard stretch. Reporting over the years, including a CBS News feature on the shuttered bird park his father once worked at, has described the family cycling through unstable housing during this period, including stretches in an old car and time spent around that abandoned aviary in Waikiki. Money was tight enough that the family went without electricity for months at a stretch. It's the kind of detail that sounds almost too cinematic to be true, except that Bruno has referenced pieces of it himself over the years in interviews, always with a shrug rather than self-pity. He kept performing anyway, because performing was the only skill he had that could turn into cash. As a teenager at Roosevelt High School in Honolulu, he sang with a doo-wop revival group called the Schoolboys, opening for his father's new band. He also picked up work impersonating Michael Jackson in a local magic show review, earning around $75 a night. Real money for a teenager and enough to fund demo recordings and bus fare. He taught himself piano, guitar, bass, and percussion along the way, treating every instrument in reach as something to be figured out rather than something to be intimidated by. In 2003, shortly after graduating high school, Bruno left Hawaii for Los Angeles. The push came partly from a family connection. His sister, working in fashion in LA, had passed one of his demo CDs to Mike Lynn, an A&R executive at Dr. Dre's Aftermath Entertainment. Lynn liked what he heard enough to fly the 18-year-old out for a meeting. Nothing came of that meeting directly, but it was enough to convince Bruno that Los Angeles was worth the risk. The city did not go easy on him. He moved on to Mansfield Avenue and found the reality of trying to break into music far rougher than he expected. Cramped apartments, thin budgets, and constant hustling for any paying gig. In 2004, Motown Records signed him. It didn't work out. The label wanted to market him as a Latin pop artist in the Ricky Martin mold, pushing him towards Spanish-language material that didn't reflect either his writing style or his actual musical instincts, which leaned toward doo-wop, reggae, R&B, and classic rock in roughly equal measure. He'd deliberately chosen the stage name Bruno Mars, pulling Bruno from his own childhood nickname and adding Mars because, as he's explained it, he wanted something that sounded bigger than life and wasn't tied to any single ethnic box a label could file him under. Motown dropped him without ever releasing a song. At the time, it felt like a dead end. In hindsight, it was the thing that freed him up to build something on his own terms. The most important relationship to come out of the Motown collapse wasn't with an executive. It was with another artist the label had also cut loose, Philip Lawrence. The two of them decided that if the industry wasn't going to hand them a deal, they'd write their way into one instead. Along with producer Ari Levine, who had studio space and equipment, they formed a production team that became known as the Smeezingtons. The name supposedly born out of the exclamation, "That's a smeeze," their shorthand for a beat or chord change that actually worked. They were relentless about the craft side of it, reportedly studying hundreds of hit songs to reverse engineer what actually made a chorus land. The payoff came in pieces. They wrote the hook for Flo Rida's Right Round, which went to #1. They wrote Nothing on You for B.O.B., another massive hit that put Bruno's own voice, distinctive high, a little raw, in front of a mainstream audience for the first time, even though the song was credited to someone else. By the time Bruno released his own debut single in 2010, the Smeezingtons had already written a string of hits for other artists, which meant the audience had been hearing his fingerprints on the radio for months without necessarily knowing his name yet. Bruno's proper solo introduction came in the form of a short, low-key EP in May 2010 for Songs Long. That came and went without much fanfare. 5 months later, in October 2010, he released his debut full album, Doo-Wops and Hooligans. Made on a comparatively modest budget, the record became a genuine phenomenon. Certified multi-platinum, selling well beyond 15 million copies worldwide over the following decade, and staying on the UK albums chart for an extraordinarily long, multi-year run that outlasted albums most people consider untouchable classics. The singles did the heavy lifting. Just the Way You Are became his first #1 hit, eventually going multi-platinum and landing among the best-selling digital tracks of the era. Grenade followed, hitting #1 in more than a dozen countries and posting one of the biggest single-week download totals of its time. Award recognition came almost immediately. 7 Grammy nominations in his debut year, including nods in the top categories, an unusually strong rookie showing. He didn't sweep the night, but he did walk away with Best Male Pop Vocal Performance, making him one of the youngest men to win that specific award in decades. 2 years later came Locked Out of Heaven, the lead single from his second album, Unorthodox Jukebox. It entered the charts modestly and then built into a genuine juggernaut, eventually spending multiple weeks at #1. Critics loved the reggae-inflected, police-influenced sound of it, framing it as a deliberate break from the EDM heavy pop landscape that dominated radio at the time. Unorthodox Jukebox as a whole leaned harder into genre experimentation than the label initially wanted, mixing disco, rock, and reggae influences, and it paid off. The album moved millions of copies worldwide and picked up Best Pop Vocal Album honors at the 2014 Grammys. If there's a single song that turned Bruno Mars from successful pop artist into generational hitmaker, it's Uptown Funk, released as a collaboration with producer Mark Ronson in late 2014. The track spent an enormous stretch at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, one of the longest reigns of the decade, and became a genuine global cultural moment, the kind of song that got played at weddings, sporting events, and, according to more than one report at the time, apparently boosted in-flight drink sales on at least one airline that used it as a boarding anthem. 2 years later, Bruno released 24K Magic, a 9-track, half-hour album deliberately built to feel like an uninterrupted late 80s and early 90s R&B mixtape. The label reportedly wasn't thrilled with how short and stylistically narrow it was going in. Bruno held his ground, and the album swept the top 3 categories, Album, Record, and Song of the Year, at the 2018 Grammys, an unusually rare full sweep that put him in a very small club of artists to pull it off twice across a career. The 24K Magic World Tour that followed ran from 2017 into the end of 2018, hitting 6 continents and well over 200 shows, and it became one of the highest-grossing tours of its era. In early 2021, Bruno teamed up with Anderson .Paak to form Silk Sonic, a project explicitly built as a throwback to early 1970s soul and funk. Live band, analog recording, no shortcuts. Their debut single, Leave the Door Open, hit #1 and became a genuine streaming phenomenon, eventually racking up billions of plays. The pair leaned hard into the aesthetic, performing in matching tuxedos with a full string section and funk legend Bootsy Collins as an onstage presence. And the song went on to sweep Record of the Year, Song of the Year, and Best R&B Performance of the Grammys. Their full album, An Evening with Silk Sonic, was recorded the old-fashioned way, in a single room with no digital patchwork, and it posted the strongest vinyl debut for an R&B act in decades. The short tour that followed grossed well over $100 million from a relatively small number of shows, underlining just how much drawing power Bruno Mars had accumulated by his mid-30s. Rather than slow down, Bruno spent 2024 stacking collaborations that reached entirely different corners of the pop world. In August 2024, he and Lady Gaga released Die With a Smile, a dramatic black-and-white video ballad that broke first-day streaming records and camped out on the charts for months, eventually going multi-platinum across dozens of countries. The two performed it together at the 2025 Grammys with a gospel choir, and the collaboration won Best Pop Duo/Group Performance. Around the same period, Bruno linked up with Rose of Blackpink for APT, a duet that became one of the biggest K-pop crossover moments in Billboard history, debuting inside the top 3 of the Hot 100 and racking up enormous view counts within its first day online. Impressive. The two later performed it together live at SoFi Stadium during Rose's tour stop, and the song has continued to resurface near the top of streaming charts well after its initial release, an unusual second life for a pop single. Between Silk Sonic, Gaga, and Rose, Bruno spent his late 30s as arguably the most in-demand collaborator in mainstream music, all while continuing to headline his own residency shows in Las Vegas. For over a decade, Bruno's personal life stayed almost entirely out of view by design. He began dating model and actress Jessica Caban in 2011, not long after the release of his debut album. She eventually relocated from New York to Los Angeles to be near him, and the two kept a home together in the years that followed, sharing a Rottweiler named Geronimo. He first acknowledged the relationship publicly in interviews years into it, and even then only in the most guarded terms, at one point telling a reporter he was reluctant to even discuss it because it was too close to home. He wrote, "When I was your man," during a rough patch in that relationship, and has said almost nothing about it publicly beyond confirming it came from something real. Over 13 years together, the two were seen in public only a handful of times, largely at award shows. That near-total silence is exactly why a single Instagram comment in January 2025 set off so much speculation. Fans had already noticed that Caban's old anniversary posts about the relationship had quietly disappeared from her account. Then, responding to a fan comment expressing sadness over the rumored end of the relationship, Caban wrote that she would always be happy for Bruno's continued success, cheering from afar. It read to a lot of people like a goodbye, without officially being one. Neither Bruno nor Caban has ever released a statement confirming a breakup, and both have continued to follow each other online since. What's actually verifiable is narrower than the headline suggested. There's a comment widely read as bittersweet, and 13 years of near-total public silence on either side since. Everything beyond that, reports of separate holidays, claims about who tried to reconcile, stories about backstage sightings, comes from anonymous sourcing that neither party has confirmed or denied, and it's worth treating it that way rather than as settled fact. The gambling story is a cleaner case study in how a rumor can outrun its own evidence. In March 2024, NewsNation ran a report, citing an unnamed, well-placed Vegas insider, claiming Bruno had accumulated roughly $50 million in gambling debt at MGM Resorts properties, and that his long-running Las Vegas residency was effectively a mechanism for working the debt off. The claim spread fast precisely because it was plausible on paper. Bruno had been open in the past about gambling since he was underage, and Las Vegas high-stakes tables really do move money in the tens of millions over a long enough stretch. Within days, the story had been repeated across entertainment blogs, sports commentary shows, and social media, with additional unverified claims piling on, including a widely shared anecdote from former NFL player Shannon Sharpe about a supposed single-night loss in the seven figures. MGM Resorts International responded quickly and directly. In a statement provided to entertainment outlets, the company said its relationship with Bruno was long-standing and rooted in mutual respect, and called the debt claim completely false, stating plainly that he had no debt with the company. It's worth noting what that statement was and wasn't. A direct, on-the-record denial from the company named in the story, with no independent court filings or financial records ever surfacing to support the original $50 million figure. Bruno himself didn't rush to respond in a formal way. Instead, over the following months, he leaned into the joke on stage and online. At one show referencing how his phone's been dry since the rumor broke, and later posting cheeky, almost out-of-debt captions around unrelated career milestones. It read less like a man managing a real financial crisis in public, and more like someone who found the whole thing funny enough to keep the bit alive. The clearest on-the-record moment came more than 2 years after the story first broke. In April 2026, opening the Romantic Tour at Allegiant Stadium in Las Vegas, his first full solo tour since 2017, Bruno brought out Anderson .Paak for a Silk Sonic reunion segment, and in the middle of the onstage banter, he addressed the rumor directly and by name. He told the crowd, plainly, that he was debt-free, and that he'd paid off whatever he owed the casino a long time ago. It wasn't a formal statement through a publicist, and it wasn't an admission that the original $50 million figure had ever been accurate. If anything, it was Bruno closing the loop on his own terms, years after MGM had already denied the debt existed at all, treating the whole saga as settled and slightly absurd rather than something that needed a serious rebuttal. That's really the through line of this entire chapter of his life. Bruno Mars has spent more than 3 decades in public, starting from an age when most people haven't even developed a personality yet, and the through line isn't scandal. It's an unusual amount of control over his own image, exercised quietly. He let a rumor about money circulate for 2 years without panicking, then shut it down himself, on his own stage, in his own words, with a joke instead of a lawsuit. He's kept a 13-year relationship almost entirely private, resisting the pressure to turn it into content, even as speculation about its status has become a recurring tabloid story. And through all of it, the actual verifiable record, the music, the sales figures, the Grammy sweeps, the sold-out stadiums, has never needed a single rumor to make it eye. Strip away the speculation about his finances and his relationship, and what's left is one of the more unusual career arcs in modern pop music. A child performer who logged nearly 1,000 shows before most kids finish elementary school. A teenager who lost his family's act and the stability that came with it. A 20-something who got dropped by a major label without releasing a single song. And a songwriter who quietly wrote hits for other artists before anyone knew his own name. From there, a debut album that stayed on a national chart for the better part of a decade. A run of #1 singles across 4 different decades of style. Doo-wop revival, reggae pop, uptown funk, retro soul, and now Latin and Philly soul influenced work on his most recent album, The Romantic, and a string of collaborations with some of the biggest names in Korean pop and mainstream pop alike. Released well into his late 30s, when a lot of pop careers have already cooled off. The rumors will probably keep circulating in some form, because that's what happens to anyone whose real story is interesting enough to get exaggerated. But the interesting part was never actually the exaggeration. It was a kid in a glitter jumpsuit in Waikiki who never really stopped performing, who turned a canceled record deal into a songwriting partnership, and who, 30 years later, is still the one deciding what gets said about him and when.